Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com, and this is anti-war news for Monday, November 7th, 2022. Hope everybody had a good weekend. The first story at the top of antiwar.com today is a bit unsettling. The U.S. Nuclear Forces Chief says that the big one is coming. So, the commander that oversees U.S. nuclear forces delivered an ominous warning at a conference last week by calling the war in Ukraine a warm up for the big one that is to come. So, this is Navy Admiral Charles Richard. He is the commander of U.S. Strategic Command, which oversees the U.S. nuclear triad. He said, quote, "This Ukraine crisis that we're in right now, this is just the warm up. The big one is coming, and it isn't going to be very long before we're going to get tested in ways that we haven't been tested in a long time." End quote. So, just to hear the head of the U.S. nuclear forces say something like that just doesn't seem like a good sign. His warning came after the U.S. released its new nuclear posture review, which reaffirms that the U.S. doctrine allows for the first use of nuclear weapons. It allows first strike. The review says that the purpose of the U.S. nuclear arsenal is to, quote, deter strategic attacks, assure allies and partners, and achieve U.S. objectives if deterrence fails, end quote. The posture review also says that the U.S., quote, would only consider the use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the United States or its allies or partners, end quote. So I actually linked to a piece from Ted Snyder that we have up for Monday in our viewpoint section. And he kind of discusses how the U.S. nuclear policy, that's pretty flexible, saying that, what would they consider defending of vital interest and of not just the United States, but also its allies and partners. That doesn't just mean NATO, that also means Japan and South Korea. Um, So this nuclear posture review, it was released along with the new national defense strategy, which names China as what they call the most comprehensive and serious challenge to the US, and it describes Russia as an acute threat. That document, as with the previous national defense strategy that was released in 2018, it makes clear that the US military is preparing for future conflicts with both Russia and China. So when he talks about the big one coming, maybe that's what he's talking about. I mean, they're preparing, while they're doing funding this proxy war on Russia's border, they are making it clear that China's the priority and they're saying they need to build up more in Asia. And Richard, as the head of Stratcom, he's previously warned that the risk of nuclear war with Russia and China is a real possibility. The way he put it, this was last year. He said that the U.S. military must, quote, shift its principal assumption from nuclear employment is not possible to nuclear employment is a very real possibility and act to meet and deter that reality, end quote. So the nuclear posture review, it calls for the modernization of the nuclear triad. And if they do the full modernization, they're already doing some of it now, but if they do the whole thing, it could cost up to $1.5 trillion. And keeping tensions high with Russia and China, it helps justify the massive price tag. That's a big part of why all this is happening. Richard said last week that the U.S. needs to put more resources into competing with China's military. Again, the focus is China. We got to invest. They're saying that we got to invest more to keep up with China. And as I've talked about a lot, Congress is looking to spend big on arming Taiwan with a plan to give the island $10 billion in military aid. That's included in the Senate's version of the National Defense Authorization Act for next year. That $10 billion would be dispersed to Taiwan over 10 years. And while this is all being done in the name of deterrence, arming Taiwan, building up around China, China's actions and rhetoric make it very clear that the more U.S. support for Taiwan, that makes a war in the region more likely, as with just so much of this. All right. So the next one here, this is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. American arms makers are cashing in on the war in Ukraine. So the war in Ukraine has spurred European countries to seek hundreds of billions in new weapons. American arms manufacturers are the biggest beneficiaries of the increased demand for weapons, according to a Yahoo News report. Ian Bond, the director of foreign policy at the Center for European Reform, described the surge in the market for weapons as the highest since the Cold War. So it's the biggest increase in military spending since then. Members of the European Union have planned to increase their defense budgets by 230 billion, led by Germany's pledge to increase military spending by 100 billion. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, European governments get most of their weapons from the US. The US weapons industry is defined by the revolving door, which refers to the phenomenon of US military officials retiring and taking jobs on the boards of corporations that produce arms. So, you think about the head of Stratcom there. Where is he going to go when he retires? And currently, the Secretary of Defense, he came from Raytheon, and his predecessors, Jim Mattis and Mark Esper, they also worked on for U.S. arms makers. So there's a few examples of big deals that have happened here. Bulgaria's legislature just approved a plan to buy 70 of Lockheed Martin's F-16s for 1.3 billion. And last week, the State Department approved a $500 million missile sale to Finland. So there's other examples. We're just going to see a ton of arms sales to Europe, to Eastern Europe, and they're just really cashing in on. It's another way they're making money on this war. Besides just the U.S. sending weapons and buying more weapons for Ukraine, all these countries are really increasing their military spending. All right, the next one here. This is from Connor Freeman. The Pentagon has announced that it's setting up a new command based in Germany to oversee the training and equipping of Ukraine's military during its fight with Russia. So there was a report maybe a few weeks ago or maybe a few months back at this point that said that the U.S. was considering opening it a command entirely dedicated to supporting the war in Ukraine, and they've done it now. It's named Security Assistance Group Ukraine, and it's going to be based in Germany. So this is just an example of that, mission creep, how the U.S. is getting more and more entrenched and involved in this war. We know the Pentagon said that they sent inspectors. There's inspectors in Ukraine right now, U.S. military personnel inspecting weapons. Now this new command, and the news of this command came after the announcement of a new weapons package for Ukraine, which is worth 400 million. It's the 25th round of security assistance for Ukraine. So this weapons package, it includes 45 refurbished T-72B tanks, which are Soviet tanks that the Pentagon, that the U.S. has purchased for Ukraine. So they're going to be sending them over, and they're saying that the Netherlands is going to be providing an additional 45 tanks, and the Czech Republic is going to help out with upgrading the tanks and all that. So yeah, more aid for Ukraine along with the new command. It just keeps coming. So the formal command will be led by a high-ranking general with a roughly 300-person staff. So that sounds like it's a lot of people. So officially, the Pentagon has said that since Russia invaded on February 24th, they've provided or pledged 19 billion in direct military aid, and that's just military equipment that they're shipping over there. Then we have data from the Kiel Institute, which is saying the real figure is closer to 28 billion. So that probably includes training and maybe U.S. deployments in the region. So it's just so much money. And the U.S. has authorized over 67 billion on spending on the war at this point, and that number is probably going to increase pretty soon. All right, the next one is good news, I think. Jake Sullivan has held undisclosed talks with Putin aides. So this is according to a report from the Wall Street Journal. On Sunday, they reported that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has, in recent months, held secret talks with high-level Russian officials. And they cited unnamed U.S. and allied officials in this report. And the official said that the talks were aimed at reducing the risk of war in Ukraine, turning into a broader conflict, and that Sullivan warned Moscow against using nuclear weapons. They said that Sullivan held talks with Yuri Uzhakov, who's a foreign policy advisor to Putin, and the secretary of the Russian Security Council. So that's Sullivan's counterpart in Russia. So as of Sunday night, the talks haven't been confirmed by the White House or the Kremlin. The National Security Council declined to comment, and a spokeswoman said that people claim a lot of things when she was asked about it. The last call that was confirmed between Sullivan and a Russian official took place back in March, the last one that was publicly acknowledged. But Sullivan did say back in September, when there was all this nuclear talk flying around, he said that the US had warned Russia of what the consequences would be if a nuclear weapon in Ukraine was used. And he said this was made at a high level in private communications. So um, we knew there was some kind of back channel talks going on. But since, Russia invaded, the US has barely engaged on a high level with Russia, at least publicly. So this is there's been talks between top US, Russian, and military officials occasionally. But there's only been one known conversation between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov. But the Blinken-Lavrov call was focused on a potential prisoner swap and not the war in Ukraine. Biden has said he doesn't want to talk to Putin. He said recently he has no intention of meeting with Putin about Ukraine. I think he's left open the possibility of talking to him about the prisoner swap, about Brittany Griner. But the Wall Street Journal report said that Sullivan is one person, one of the few people within the administration that has been pushing for lines of communication with Russia, while many others have not. So, hopefully it said that these talks have happened. They didn't say how many calls happened. I mean, who knows if this was just him calling up and warning them about nuclear weapons, or if there's some real diplomacy going on here. Hopefully there is. And we know that wanting diplomacy with Russia has become a very unpopular view in Washington, especially after that group of 30 progressive Democrats sent a letter to President Biden that very mildly called for talks with Russia. But after facing backlash, the letter was quickly retracted. And it was blamed on the staff. I mean, it was really unbelievable the way they handled that. The Wall Street Journal report also said, so this is good news too, also said that the US and Russian officials are planning to hold a meeting of the Bilateral Consultative Commission. And that's a compliance and implementation body that was established by the New START Treaty. The New START Treaty is the last piece of nuclear arms control between the US and Russia, and it limits the deployment of warheads, missiles, and bombers. So the idea of holding the talks, inspections under this treaty have been on pause for a while. They're suspended due to COVID. So the idea of the talks is to get working on resuming those inspections. And then hopefully from there can be some more talk about replacing New START, which expires in 2026, and maybe some more nuclear arms control treaties. Although, I'm not going to be too naive here. I don't really think the chances for a big breakthrough when it comes to nuclear arms control are very high at this point. But hopefully, these talks are going on and that they're continuing. It just wasn't a few conversations. The next one is more about talks. I don't really know how to take this one. So the Washington Post reported on Saturday that the U.S. is privately encouraging Ukraine to signal an openness to negotiations with Russia, but they want this done for public relations purposes, not to actually pursue diplomacy. Sources told the Post that the U.S. wants Zelensky to drop his official position of ruling out talks with Russia as long as Putin is president. If you remember, Zelensky recently signed a decree ruling out talks with Russia as long as Putin is president, essentially calling for regime change before negotiations can happen. So the idea of pushing him to drop that is to maintain support for Ukraine from nations that are uneasy about Zelensky's stance on negotiations and are just worrying that this war is going to go on for years and years, and it's really having an impact. Um, so I'll just read from the Washington Post report here. It says, quote, the request by American officials is not aimed at pushing Ukraine to the negotiating table, these people said. Rather, they called it a calculated attempt to ensure the government in Kiev maintains the support of other nations facing constituencies wary of fueling a war for many years to come, end quote. So, I mean, they're basically saying that they're doing it, but they're not actually going to lean on them to talk. But who knows? Maybe this is a good sign. I don't know. I've seen some people being optimistic about it, but uh, we'll see. I mean, it's just good that they're talking about negotiations and stuff because Russia has been Putin and other officials have been very outspoken lately, saying that they want to talk, but Zelensky and Ukrainian officials, besides their stance on peace talks, they have maximalist war goals, which include expelling Russia from Crimea. So that just shows again that they expect the war to last a long time. And the Washington Post had previously reported that U.S. officials have ruled out the idea of pushing Ukraine to negotiate, even though they don't think Ukraine can win the war outright, as they put it. So, yeah, just kind of a strange one. All right, the next one here, the U.S. flew warplanes toward Iran over Saudi claims of imminent attack. So this is another one from the Washington Post. They reported that U.S. Central Command launched warplanes based in the Persian Gulf toward Iran after Saudi Arabia claimed that Tehran was planning an imminent attack on the kingdom. So the Saudis made the warning last week. There's no indication, and we haven't seen any signs besides this claim that Iran is planning to attack Saudi Arabia. The Saudis did also warn that Iran was planning attacks on Iraq's northern Kurdistan region, where Iran has launched strikes in recent weeks, but there haven't been any since the Saudi warning. But the deployment of U.S. warplanes toward Iran, it demonstrates the continued close military ties between Washington and Riyadh, despite President Biden's warning of consequences over the OPEC Plus decision to reduce oil production by 2 million barrels per day. Democrats were furious at the Saudis over the OPEC Plus cuts, which came ahead of the midterm elections that are coming up Tuesday. But so far, the U.S. has not taken concrete action to change the relationship with the Saudis over the move. So again, I mean, you read this Washington Post report and everything else, they're acting like there was an imminent attack, but there's just still no sign that I can't. Why would Iran attack Saudi Arabia? It doesn't make any sense right now, considering the stuff they're dealing with. But the Saudis do often blame Iran for Houthi attacks. Even though the Houthi attacks are obviously a response. They're part of the war that the Saudis, the U.S. backed war on Yemen that the Saudis have been waging since 2015. But since March, there have been no reports of Houthi attacks in Saudi Arabia or Saudi airstrikes in Yemen, but the war could escalate at any moment as a ceasefire expired at the beginning of October. When I first saw the Saudi warning last week of these Iranian attacks, I feared that it was sort of like maybe a pretext for them to start bombing Yemen again. But again, we still haven't seen that, which is very good. Even though the ceasefire expired, they still aren't bombing Yemen. That's good. Hopefully it stays like that. All right, the next one here. This is from Connor Freeman again. Netanyahu ally says Israel will attack Iran absent a new nuclear deal. So, if Washington does not secure a new nuclear deal or take military action itself, incoming Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will attack Iran, according to a longtime member of Israel's Likud party. A former settlement minister issued the warning while speaking with Israel's Channel 12 News on Friday. So, they're warning that Netanyahu is going to act to destroy nuclear facilities in Iran, saying that he's not going to wait around. The big question about this is if the Israelis have the capability to actually bomb Iranian nuclear facilities, because they have a few issues. One is that They apparently don't have the tankers needed to refuel their planes to make the full flight to Iran and back to Israel. They're buying tanker planes from the US, but they're not going to be delivered, I think, maybe until 2026. Now, they could also, since they have these new Gulf allies, it's possible that they could land in Bahrain or something and refuel there, but I'm not sure if that would be enough for their planes. And then a lot of Iran's nuclear facilities are underground or being built underground because of the Israeli they launch covert attacks on these facilities all the time. So Israel also doesn't have bunker busting bombs that could go destroy facilities that are deep underground. So there's going to be a lot of threats and stuff from Netanyahu, but could they actually pull off strikes like that? It's not really clear. But they have been simulating. The IDF has been saying that they're excuse me, that they're preparing plans on how to strike Iran, and they simulated war games. And the Biden administration is also sort of threatening military action, saying that they'll use a military option as a last resort to prevent a nuclear armed Iran. But at the same time, in the new nuclear posture review, they admitted that Iran is not trying to make a nuclear weapon. So, they're just going to go along with whatever Israel wants. Hopefully that doesn't extend to bombing Iran. All right, the next one here, more tensions around the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. flies B-1B supersonic bombers over South Korea for the first time since 2017. So the U.S. flew two of these supersonic B-1B bombers on Saturday over South Korea as tensions continue to rise. The bombers participated in the last day of massive aerial war games that the U.S. and South Korea held, known as Vigilant Storm. The exercises were initially set to conclude on Friday, but were extended into Saturday over North Korea's missile tests. So again, I know I covered this a lot last week. They launched these huge war games. North Korea reacts, and then they extend the war games in response to North Korea's reaction, which were missile and artillery tests. And then, there's more. It's just this spiral of escalation. And this year's iteration of these drills were the largest ever. And after the drills were extended into Saturday, North Korea launched 4 more missiles. And on Monday, North Korea's military said that the Vigilant Storm exercises were, quote, an open provocation aimed at intentionally escalating the tension and a dangerous war drill of very high aggressive nature, end quote. So these drills, for a week long from Monday to Saturday, originally scheduled from Monday to Friday, but they went an extra day, involved 240 warplanes, and they went 24 hours a day, and that's simulating bombing North Korea. So of course North Korea is going to react. And the Biden administration, they still show no signs in changing its approach to North Korea, and the tit for tat escalations will likely continue. The U.S. is calling for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, but they're also issuing threats against Pyongyang. I linked here to one that Kyle wrote a few weeks ago, that Wendy Sherman, the Deputy Secretary of State, warned that the U.S. would use nuclear weapons. It's all of its capabilities to defend South Korea and Japan from North Korea. So threatening to use nuclear weapons while also calling for them to denuclearize, it's just not a position that's going to make any progress in that situation. But that's it for the news. We have a lot of good viewpoints, as always. One from Ted Snyder about the nuclear posture review that I mentioned earlier. A great one from Ray McGovern about the New York Times latest Russiagate article that they recently published. One from Patrick O'Reilly about Serbia, the West's ongoing coercion of Serbia. So a lot of good stuff as always. Go check that out. There's always a ton of stuff to read here. I go over the news section, but we just have a ton of stuff. We also have content in the blog and everything. So just always a lot of content. But that's it for me for today. I will catch you guys tomorrow. You can If you want to contact the show, you can email us at news@antiwar.com. You can follow me on Twitter, follow antiwar.com on Twitter. Antiwar.com also has a Facebook page. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, Odyssey, Rumble. Share the show with your friends and leave reviews. That in the Apple podcast, especially reviews help for the show. So do all that. And thanks for listening. I'll talk to you tomorrow.